To continue with the concept of different intelligences, we now look at another concept that neuroscientists and psychologists agree on, and that is our brain depends on experience. Everybody's brain is different because everybody's brain is the product of those experiences that they had throughout the lifespan. And dendrites are going to form and myelination is going to change throughout our life. And yes, middle childhood is very critical, but it doesn't stop there. It is building on what came in early childhood, and it will continue with what is coming from adolescence. So, by default, children who might not have the same um, experiences as other children might have a different brain pattern, if you may. So, if a child has a different brain pattern, it could very well be just the way the brain wired itself during development due to the exposures and the experiences of that child. Now, with children who have disorders, it means that they have an unusual brain pattern. And if we have a specific training or intervention, we can change those patterns. One of those important new concepts that is now evolving is the concept of neurodiversity. And neurodiversity means that each person has neurological strengths and weaknesses that we should appreciate. So we can't say that this is a normal brain and this is an abnormal brain. The diverse neurological patterns are just simply a differentiation, not a better or worse. So those people who might not have the same wiring, if you say, can perhaps have strengths in other areas that we can utilize and seek the help of in comparison to someone who has the strengths in a different area. So not everybody's brain is the same. So this concept of diversity of the neural connections or neurological connections is a new concept that gives us a better understanding of how our brains differ. Now, developmental psychopathology is a field that uses basically the information and insight that we have of a typically developing brain to understand and kind of intervene and remediate developmental disorders of the mind. So if we see a pattern that is not developing or that is presenting itself as atypical, then we can perhaps intervene to kind of train or modify that pattern to help that person function fully. When we put children by age groups in schools, as we do in middle childhood, we start to see those differences a little bit more frequently than we did earlier. So during infancy, a child is bound to their home. Not much comparison. Some parents might see that, he walked before his brother or she talked before her sister. All of those differences you're comparing to your own children. But then in preschool, sometimes when the child actually does get enrolled in a preschool, we might start to see some red flags or some things that are not adding up early on. But not every child goes to a preschool. But when we have mandatory education, which starts usually in middle childhood, is when we start to see those learning differences. And that is where we see the the I want to say the red flags. And this is where we should be catching those red flags early on so that we can intervene. The DSM 5 is basically the Bible or the manual for diagnosing any of those disorders. So, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the fifth edition, is basically the book that is used by psychologists to diagnose any of those excuse me, disabilities. And we start with looking at how easy or how hard is it to really make such diagnosis, because if we learn what goes into the diagnosis, we can understand why it takes a lot of time to give that label or to give that service. So there's a lot of caution that needs to be taken into consideration when we talk about psychopathology because of two concepts. The first one is what we call multifinality, and the second is equifinality. Multifinality means that many. Finality means the final manifestation, the final presentation of the disease. So when we talk about psychopathology, we're talking about disorders that might have one cause but manifest themselves, present themselves in different ways. So in order for you to diagnose, you have to know that the way it looks in one child might not be the same as the way it looks in another child. So you have to keep in mind that it presents itself differently in different children. So let's say there is an infant who is flooded with stress hormone due to, let's say, abuse. This infant who has the cause is stress might grow up to become hypervigilant, a person who is extremely hyper, alert, anything triggers them, or a very easily angered person, or a person that is not affected at all, doesn't look like he had any issues. All three of them are okay or possible presentations of the source or the cause, which was stress. Similarly, you might have equifinality, meaning that one symptom can be a result of many causes. So just because I see a child who is nonverbal, doesn't talk in the class, my mind should not go automatically to, well, maybe he can't hear. There's a hearing disorder. Because the possibility of it being a hearing impairment is one, but also it could be that the child is autistic, and also it could be that the child has a pathological, which is not normal, it's a disorder, shyness. So the child is obsessively shy. So all three of those causes three different problems, three different treatments give the same presentation or the same symptom, and that is nonverbal. So this complexity of diagnosis is kind of the reason why a lot of psychologists don't label right away. It takes time to label, and of course sometimes when the label is given, there's a lot of perhaps a push and shove and kind of resentment, maybe from the school system or maybe the parents or maybe the environment, to accept that diagnosis. So there's a lot of complexity in the process of identifying children with special needs. Now, your book goes into reflecting on three particular um, disorders that present themselves and affect children, particularly during the middle childhood years. And that is autism, the autism spectrum disorder, ASD. And I want to make sure that you guys watch all the videos that are attached to this chapter, because they explain them in a much better way than I would. But definitely, I'm going to go over them during these slides. So we start with autism, and autism is basically a developmental disorder. All of the ones that we're going to talk about today are developmental disorders. So autism is a developmental disorder that is marked, the hallmark of autism is the difficulty with social communication and interaction. So it's a social communication deficiency. There's a problem with socializing with others. And this, of course, includes when you socialize with people, it means that you have to understand that people have different feelings or different views. Remember the theory of mind. So the theory of mind is really underdeveloped in children with autism. And it could also manifest itself with restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior or interest or activities. So they insist on doing certain things and continue to do it and do it for prolonged periods of time. In the United States, amongst 8-year-olds, so in middle childhood, there is a 1 in 68 children that is diagnosed with ASD. And again, ASD is a spectrum, meaning that it goes from very mild to very severe. So, and it presents itself in multiple manifestations. So, again, it affects about 1 in 68 and 3 times as many in boys than it does in girls. Now, 46%, that's close to 50%, close to the half of these children are scoring normal or above normal in IQ. That tells you a lot about associating certain disorders with a person's potential or ability. This has nothing to do with their intellectual ability. Some of them score below, which means that there is a slow learning or inability to function intellectually. But the majority of them, as you can see, 46%, actually are normally developing in the intellectual part. Now, very important to note that when you see many of those pictures that we see on YouTube or on social media of these children with autism having a complete meltdown and being extremely, violent or hard to control in public places because of one particular notable problem, and that is their sensory cortex. The cortex is the outside, remember, the outside part of your brain that receives all the signals from your body is hypersensitive. It's hyper alert. It is it's lit up when it goes outside. So everything that they come in contact with activates that sensation. So if they're hypersensitive to smell, to touch, to noise, to things that they see. So all these signals are coming at the same time. They have a really hard time suppressing or controlling or shutting down or regulating what comes in. So everything kind of gets them aroused, and that's what makes them usually upset by exposure to noise or light or a lot of sensations. Now, remember that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. The manifestation of the disorder is different in one child than in another, and that's why it became a disorder than a spectrum than it was one particular set of symptoms that they are going to look for, and then they diagnose the child as autistic. Detection is at this point is bound by behavioral science. So you're gonna be very in tune with the child to see what kind of repetitive actions, behavioral actions that they're doing that can signal that something is off or something is wrong. So in early infancy, you can actually detect it very early with that social smile. Remember, we said that around 6 weeks, the child should have that social smile. And social smile, just from the word social, means that there is a representation of interaction and gazing into that adult's face. So because they have a disconnect with social communication, this is one of the biggest markers early infancy that they miss. The next one that is discussed in your book is ADD and ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And this is a disorder that presents itself in one of three ways. It's either going to be a child who has an inability to pay attention, and pay attention, the problem is not lack of paying attention, it's that they're paying attention to everything, they just can't regulate themselves. Okay, so remember when we said selective attention? Selective attention means that I can select one thing to focus on and shut everything else. This is an area that they do not have the ability to master. So it is hard for people with ADD or ADHD to organize or finish a task because it requires them to pay attention for that task and shut everything else around it. Attention to details is very hard. Following instructions or conversations, the person is easily distracted by other things because everything gets their attention. Hyperactive impulsive is a person that really fidgets a lot, talks a lot, interrupts people, might grab something from a person, speaks inappropriately, or has a hard time waiting their turn. So this hyper impulsive is another manifestation of the disorder. And then you can have both of them, which is ADHD, and that is the combination of symptoms of the two. Inability or to pay attention, inattentive, and hyperactive or impulsive. Children with ADD and ADHD have academic difficulties and definitely low self-esteem because, as you can see, if they are the kind that doesn't pay attention, the teacher is probably asking them for why did you not finish this project, why did you not submit this paper, why didn't you finish your homework, and so forth. If they are hyperactive and impulsive, then they're probably the ones that are interrupting the teacher in the middle of class or acting impulsively. Remember, impulse control is an executive function, and without impulse control, we do not function well in a social context. So chances are they're the ones that are picked on in a classroom setting. Problem with diagnosis is that the original reason why you might have this disorder is in the brain. So it's neurological. There is a problem in the executive area, in the brain regulating their impulses and their emotions and their actions. So this inability to regulate is going to be the reason. However, we tend to see that the rates of diagnosing or labeling children with ADD and ADHD are extremely high in the United States, putting kind of like a question mark on, is there another problem that we're dealing with here? Are we over-diagnosing? Are we misdiagnosing those children? And if we are, what is the cause? So one of the increased reason for concern is that if you have a misdiagnosis and you're starting to treat it, then you're treating the wrong disease. If you have a misdiagnosis you could be given a person some sort of a drug, and we see this in adolescents who seek to be diagnosed with ADD to get their hands on amphetamines and abuse those drugs. And we also have a potential for concern if we are diagnosing atypical behavior as pathological. If we are looking at a child who just is acting their age, a 5-year-old is supposed to fidget. It's okay. Not all 5-year-olds can control their impulses yet. So for me to refer a 5-year-old or to assume that a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old should all behave the same way could be setting them up for a misdiagnosis as well.